back at you again. Good afternoon, all. It's afternoon where I am. I am Senator James Sanders Jr., and this is a show designed to cut through the fat that we hear about. This is a show designed to get past all of that fuzzy talk that's out there, those murky ideas. My show is called Let's Be Clear. And here we try to really speak of what are the real issues that we're dealing with? What are the real questions? And we bring on some of the best people that money can't buy to speak of issues that need to be spoken. And we have a show today, Juneteenth. So America has finally got the word, has it? Well, you're hearing of Congress. Everybody's falling over themselves, seemingly, to do something about Juneteenth. What next? Reparations? Well, there we go thinking again. But we're going to discuss what is Juneteenth, how did it come about, does it have any significance for anything outside of Texas, and where will this road take us? Where, if we make it a federal holiday, does that mean I get a day off or with pay? I mean, what does all this mean? Now, on a personal level, I'll trade it for reparations, but there I go thinking again. Dr. Foreman, save me from myself. Would you be kind enough to introduce people to this noble organization that you are representing? And I also want you to speak of what is the name of your book. In fact, I want everybody to put their book in the chat. But what is the name of your book? And save me from myself, or else I'm gonna tell you all kinds of stuff. But let's be clear, Dr. Foreman. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Yes, I am president of the Manhattan branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, known as ASALH, and actually was an organization founded by Carter G. Woodson, who was known as the father of Black history. And he basically discovered that there was a dearth or a lack of Black history and culture being taught amongst the masses, and he was inspired to start this illustrious organization. And so I'm here representing the Manhattan branch. I believe, in terms of my book, it is Lessons from the Breaking Bias, Lessons from the Amistad, which just was published back in November by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation. I will put the title.
What is it about?
It's about basically teaching Black history in the classroom. It teaches teachers how to teach Black history in the classroom. It provides history on the African civilization, the African American experience in the United States, starting with American slavery up through the 1960s. And basically, our goal is to educate school teachers in the state of New Jersey and teaching them how to teach their students and how to broach, the topics of history in the United States and in Africa.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. Now, how did you find out about Juneteenth?
Well, several years ago, actually, a friend of mine, I don't know, this was many, many years ago, not to date myself, but she had, invited me over for a festival. Her parents actually used to celebrate it every year. And I had only heard a little bit about it because obviously I was not taught about Juneteenth in school. And my parents really did not discuss it with me either. They really didn't know that many details about it. Again, growing up on the Jersey Shore, coming from New Jersey, I did not learn the history with regards to Juneteenth at all, quite frankly. And this was in my teenage years and back in the 80s. And eventually, as I became more and more curious and more educated, I, began to learn more and more about Juneteenth and the significance of it. And to be honest with you, there's so many variations that have been written with regards to this holiday, with regards to the events that have worked up, to June 19th. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion about those events today. Very
And we
excited.
and we will. And we will.
Yeah.
Dr. Forster, um, this idea of Juneteenth has swept the nation. I was about to say seems to know, and it has swept the nation. Are you surprised at the reaction to the nation, at least so far?
I'm surprised that it took so long. And and I'd like to take you back to what happened last year when George Floyd was murdered, and there was that outpouring, and remember around that time too, just around the whole world, people were up in their criticisms of white supremacy and what was happening. And if you listen to that conversation internationally, you would see that Juneteenth was part of it. And because Juneteenth has always been sort of like the high mark in the Pan Africanist notion of the ideal of the promised land. So when we hear Martin Luther King and others talk about, I've seen the promised land and places like that, he might have taken a glimpse of that on Juneteenth. Because Juneteenth, I want to suggest to you, is a magical moment. It's an inflection moment in world history. It was a moment when, for the first time in the entire Americas, there was the belief that people of African ancestry and enslaved Africans could be free, could be human beings, could be citizens, because a civil war had been fought on that very issue. And it was decided, even if at the end of a sword, that freedom for enslaved people was the high point. Now, if the North had lost, there is no doubt that the Confederacy, the Southern Confederacy, would have reimposed slavery on the elsewhere in the United States and even in the British possessions in the Caribbean and even in Haiti. They ended up doing that in 1915 anyway. But but they would have gone out and they would have totally eradicated the idea and the praxis that people could be free. So on June 16th, when the word came finally to the brothers and sisters in Texas that they are free, that was a magical moment. And it was a magical moment whether you were in Brazil, whether you were in Montego Bay, and where a couple of years later you had the Montego Bay uprisings, or whether you were in Argentina, or if you had gone through the Underground Railroad into Canada, throughout the region. And then the irony was that in that brief moment where there was hope and expectations, and out of that came the various amendments that talk about civil rights for Black people and human rights, and then we lost it. So, to some extent, from about 1874 onwards, we have been trying to grasp that moment of Juneteenth, of getting back to that moment when the world was full of possibilities. And that's why I think now that we are having every year to celebrate it, that it gives us that opportunity to think of the possible, to go back every year and remind ourselves of what was fought for in the 1860s, where thousands of people from around the Americas flocked to the side of the Union and fought for freedom because they knew that when they fought for freedom, that they were fighting for freedom not only in the United States but they were fighting for freedom throughout the Americas and indeed the world. And that is what I like to think of the greatness of America, if America is an ideal, that it was in that moment that there was the ideal that freedom really meant something, that in fact Lincoln was right when he rewrote the narrative about what the founding fathers intended when he talked about democracy as a new kind of democracy that included all people. And that was the quintessential moment for me that is captured in Juneteenth. So it is not only a celebration for us in the United States, it is very much a universal Pan Africanist ideal.
Well, after Dr. Jackson, after Professor Foster tells us his book, I have a question about this Juneteenth. In fact, I'll cheat and I'll let you think about it. I want to know what took so long. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation long before this. I mean, didn't he do that in 63, was it? Why did it take, why wouldn't it, why didn't we have Juneteenth in 63? However, Dr. Forster, what is the name of your work?
My latest book is They Call Me George, the untold story of Black sleeping car porters and the making of modern Canada. And it is a continuation of what I was talking about, how, because as you know, after Juneteenth and after Emancipation, many of the Black folk, the only jobs that were available to them were as sleeping car porters. And that continued well into the 1960s with the coming of the civil rights movement. So the sleeping car porter was in many regards, the ultimate in job hopes and expectations for a lot of Black people throughout the Americas. And in North America, whether it is in the United States or Canada, they would even recruit the sleeping car porters from the islands and bring them up. But and someone like yourself who is in New York, and you know that around the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, ASALH, Randolph Phillips, and others that are there, and the excellent story of the University of Blackness that were the bookstores that were around Flatbush and those places. They taught a different story. They taught a story even about how we should get rid of the notion of being called Negroes and how we should accept ourselves as African Americans or Jamaican Americans or Barbadian Americans, and how we have real human identities that speak to our different humanity, but a humanity in which we are all equal. So these sleeping car porters, to some extent, just like if we take the idea of all of the people, the African peoples that benefited from June 16th, took many of those same ideas and brought them to fruition. The Fair Employment Act, the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Movement, these were all America wide events.
Well, Dr.
Very
Forster,
often,
you're right about this, but you
overlooked.
have driven the conversation. You've put us on that train too soon. I
Ah,
want I want Dr. Jackson to explain why we didn't get on that very train that you're speaking of in 1863. Uh,
It's a great
Lincoln
question.
wrote it. He gave us our freedom.
No, wait a minute. We might be jumping the gun too soon there and talking about this. I mean, we really do have to think about emancipation as a process, right? I mean, the question about what took so long is a good one, but I'm gonna twist it a little bit.
Okay.
And if we look at emancipation as a process, well, if we look at emancipation as a process, y'all need to be talking about July 4th, 1827, right? I think that's when slavery was abolished in New York.
Okay.
But even just thinking about the Civil War, which I think is rightfully brought into this, that in many ways Juneteenth is a military celebration.
Now, the Emancipation Proclamation does not actually change any policy. It does not make slavery illegal. It does not abolish slavery. Oh, yeah. You got to go here.
Are you telling me that Lincoln freed people in areas where he had no control? That's not.
No.
What are you saying? What are you saying?
But he does kick off a process. So it is, well, I don't know if he kicks off a process, he builds on a process. Okay. We can talk about the war starting in 1861. One of the things about the war starting in 1861 is that all of the people who were involved in the structure of maintaining slavery in the South, slave patrols, slave masters, they get real busy all of a sudden because they get sent off to fight the war. Now, people have been escaping slavery since slavery started, but this is a critical mass of people escaping slavery because that structure has broken down. So people look busy, that's a good time to get away. Now, because it's a critical mass of people leaving slavery and finding Union lines, because, you know, the enemy of my enemy might be my friend. You don't know yet, but it's that pressure of enslaved people showing up on Union lines that starts to push policy. I mean, how's the United States going to respond to these people? I think it's clear to say that the Confederacy organized itself to start a national slave society. It was about slavery for them. But fighting back against them, the United States was not necessarily about emancipation. They were about the Union. It takes this critical mass of people actually leaving the plantations to push that policy. Even then, once Lincoln sort of agrees with some of his generals and decides, okay, well, maybe we can use these formerly enslaved people who've just done the freedom with their feet move as part of the war effort, it's still not policy abolishing slavery. So of course, you still have 4 states in the Union that are slave states: Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. Emancipation Proclamation doesn't touch that at all. And more than it being a policy that actually abolishes slavery in the South, it's a warning. It's come back into the fold now, or we will confiscate your slaves, like the American government will confiscate your slaves. Not, okay, now we believe in some sort of complete abolition of slavery. So, but what it does do, I think, is really interesting. It puts Black men in the Union blue. And now for the emancipation to actually go into effect, you have to have military victory, which is what makes this so interesting, right? So every time an army, and a lot of times these include Black soldiers, go into the South, win a victory, replant the United States flag, and declare those people traitors, then they can say, okay, now the slaves of this area are free. Now that means that there's all these different freedom days everywhere, because whenever that happened, then people celebrated the abolition of slavery, which is great. Now, this keeps on going, right? So 1863, now you have these liberating armies coming through. We know that Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865. But the Army of the Trans-Mississippi West out in Texas do not do that. They do not surrender. And they hope to actually establish Texas as an independent slave nation. And they fully expect, just like the Confederacy did, that after they whoop the US, they're going to go into Mexico and make that a slave nation. They're going to go into South America, all the way down to Argentina, and have a huge slave society nation after that. There's these grand hopes. Now, after Appomattox, the United States government sends these troops, 7 units of which are Black soldiers, to Texas to finish this thing off. And sort of unceremoniously, on May 26, 1865, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi West surrenders too. This sets the stage for this last of the military freedom moments, which is Juneteenth. Now, of course, Delaware and Kentucky, they're still sitting up there holding slaves because they're not part of this Confederacy. So there's no defeat for them. They actually will hold tight to slavery until the 13th Amendment is ratified by the requisite number of states on December 6th. So this thing is really a process. And even then, we kind of have to ask if the abolition of slavery and freedom are the same thing.
Well, some say that the process has not finished, but Dr. Foreman, while some are saying that the process is now finished, some are trying to finish the process. We are seeing, it's an amazing time that we live. And I tell people, anybody who's bored in this day and age, it's because you're boring. There's no way you could be bored with all of these things happening. And let me show you a strange dichotomy. On one hand, we've got the Senate and all kinds of places jumping up and saying that we're going to give you June 19th, Juneteenth. All right. But is this not the same Senate that's the same folk who are reinstituting Jim Crow, and not at the Senate, but at the government level, state level? Are we not? Is this not the same time when we're talking about Juneteenth, and we're talking of our dear President Biden's policies for Black people? Are we not at the time when we're seeing an attack on the critical race theory? And all of you are going to take a bite at this one, because are we not while we're talking of Juneteenth, is this very capital of the U.S., has the smoke stopped lifting from the sedition attempt on in January 6th? Was that not the Confederate flag that I saw being waved in the Capitol? Was it maybe these things? Wait a minute. How can you have Juneteenth with all of these things? Who won the Civil War? I'm sorry. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I slept through something. How do you explain what is happening in America today, Dr. Foreman?
So what I'm saying is that, historically there has been resistance to progress and movements. So this time period is nothing different, right? In terms of how we have reacted to social movements, how they call it, white resistance, if you will, to different types of progress that have tried to, we've tried to, um, have in the United States. This time period is no different. The whole January 6th insurrection is a fear of change. They say that the ultimate reason for the reaction is that they're trying to convince individuals that you should be afraid of immigrants. You should be afraid of Black progress. You should be afraid of the fact that we have a African American an Indian vice president. Ultimately, that's the root, I believe, of the insurrection. It's a resistance to the change and to the progress. And so, after Reconstruction, for example, when we had, the Jim Crow, the lynching, and the murders and so forth, that was all based on. Those were signs of resistance to progress. Okay, so it was nothing has changed. It's like it's a promise that has been unfulfilled. Like we claim that we have more rights as individuals in the United States. We claim that we have civil rights, we have political rights. But the fact of the matter is, like I said, as far back as Reconstruction, since that was the era when we call ourselves trying to make significant changes and quote unquote equalize American society, it was unsuccessful. And again, it's that resistance to social change, I believe, and many others, I believe, think that it is the root causes to a lot of these problems. So, even with Juneteenth, in terms of recognizing this as a particular holiday and understanding all of the factors and historical events that took place behind Juneteenth, you know, how many people are really going to learn about, this event in schools? Are we really teaching the details of the Juneteenth event, or is it just another holiday and we really do not understand the significance of it? And understanding that it was significant in the state of Texas. Another issue is that, you know, the way that Juneteenth has been represented is that it freed all slaves in the United States. That's not true. the 13th Amendment, not until December of 1865, under the ratification of the 13th Amendment, did the legalized slavery actually end. But it's been, written that Juneteenth, was the end of slavery. And again, we have poorly written historical facts, poor teachings of these facts, and people are not knowing and understanding the details. And again, if you're not really knowing, all of the history and all of the facts behind these events, you're going to continue to think that, you are, um, you know, the true American culture, right? Like any other culture is an invasion on the Anglo, culture. And so we will continue to be miseducated, and we continue to misrepresent the facts, in terms of history. So you're going to have a January 6th. You're going to have individuals that are going to vote in that particular interest in believing that that insurrection was justified.
Well, Dr. Foster, I'm a little slow, so you're gonna have to take your time and work with me. A guy like me, it seemed to me that I'm just seeing flashbacks to the post Reconstruction. I'm seeing flashbacks to that period. I thought that we beat the Confederates the first time, and yet here they come running up again. I, I don't know how we could talk of having Juneteenth when we are reimposing some of the Jim Crow laws and the attack on the critical race theory. How soon before you attack Juneteenth? I mean, how can you speak of doing things around Juneteenth and yet you're going up there and saying, but you can't teach about it? I, is it, am I missing something, sir? Maybe explain it to me. Maybe I've been in Canada too long.
Maybe, no, I don't think so. But there is a old saying somewhere in one of the great books about putting new wine in the old skins. And I think that's the case of what we've been trying to do for the longest of time. And for me, while I talk about Juneteenth as the idea behind it, the problem is that we have been trying to make this idea work in a structure, in a system that was not set up to accept the idea. Indeed, the idea was forced on the system because that's why you needed the war. And that has been the problem, that we have not been changing the system. And the system every so often becomes like the forest that comes back in and wipe out the old growth and reestablish the old growth, and we're back to doing the same thing all over. It is like in those old Western movies when evil never dies. It is always coming back in a new form in the next episode. And that's what we are faced with. And for me, that's why Juneteenth reinforced for us the idea that we can be equal, that we can have that glorious moment, that we can see the promised land. And not only see the promised land, that maybe someday we have built that path that allow us into the promised land. But we don't have the structures in place. And indeed, if we jump ahead to today, what we're seeing even in Texas itself, what's happening in the Senate there and elsewhere, that they are reinforcing the barricades, they are reinforcing the structures, so that a society that never intended for us to be recognized as fully human is going back to its old form of slamming the doors on us. And that's why we have to keep fighting and to keep pounding and to say, let's return to the ideas that we captured and we celebrated for Juneteenth. So it is the structure that we still have to deal with. And until we are willing to create new norms, new normalcy. We are just going to be celebrating the hollowness of a dream deferred.
Yes, there you go. Dr. Jackson, there's an economist whose name I'm too scared to mention, has said that history repeats itself twice, once in tragedy, another time in farce. And the tragedy of the Reconstruction, what happened to us at the end of the Reconstruction period, we I seem to see some echoes here because how can you, on one hand, a nation say, "All right, we recognize that there is a Juneteenth, we can have a Juneteenth moment." Okay, and that's the juror. They can do that by giving law, and I know a little something of law. And at the same time, there's something called de facto, when in reality, you are taking away these people's rights. If you're taking away, making it harder to vote and reimposing Jim Crow light, uh, eh, then what is the value of Juneteenth?
I mean, this is a really interesting question. And I've actually been thinking a lot about it this week, and I'm glad that we sort of brought in structure, right? I mean, I'm going to start by sort of saying that part of this is about what we expect a national holiday to do for us, I guess,
Okay.
right? I mean, I think that national holidays always are going to do the work of nation building for sure, right? That's the sort of structure behind them. And in that way, I think that, in some ways it's sort of ironic because most of our national holidays have come after the Civil War and have been about reuniting North and South into, sometimes at the expense of Black folks completely. And so this concept of trying to bring, integrate national holidays is sort of interesting too. And as a historian, I think it's an interesting thing to think about, like, how do you tell the story? Is there a way to control this narrative? Maybe, right? I mean, one of the things that I always think is important about, Juneteenth, there's sort of two different tracks that are going. One is Juneteenth as a celebration of Black folks freeing themselves, which I think is a really important part of the process, right? Like, I don't want to discount that, Juneteenth is the final culmination of, a civil war within a civil war, enslaved people in the South fighting back against a structure of slavery that existed and that was being amplified by a Confederate government. This concept of self-freedom, I think is important. And I think that that's an important part of it. At the same time, nationalizing a holiday like Juneteenth can quickly become a way to, pat ourselves on the back and say, okay, now it's all over, right? It's done with. When Juneteenth is also a reminder that white supremacy didn't need slavery to reinforce itself, right? That after slavery ended, new structures arose that did the same work of white supremacy, namely in this case, right, the end of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow segregation. And that shows us that for every victory, there's a comeback. I mean, this is really the struggle that never stops, right? I mean, I do think that Reconstruction was a revolutionary moment. I mean, the biracial state governments rewrote state constitutions that started school systems, reduced property qualifications for voting. This is the first time in the South that universal male suffrage actually exists at the local level. Reconstruction was a revolution. Of course, there was a counter-revolution that came right back out after it, and that's history all the time. And so I hope that Juneteenth, if we're going to nationalize it, is also a way to talk about how structures do that and how to recognize the structures we're living in right now, which I think, as everybody sort of pointed to, is quite possibly, maybe definitely, another one of these counter-revolution moments.
Now, even as you guys get your last thoughts together, because time flies, I am reminded of that. I forgot who told the story of the colonialists who came to Africa, and when they came, we had the land, they had the Bible, they taught us the Bible, they had us kneel, and when we looked up, we had the Bible, but they had the land. Could it be seen that, you know, we have Juneteenth, but we can't vote about it? We have Juneteenth, but now you can't even speak about it in school because if the attack on critical race theory actually continues, that's the Juneteenth will absolutely fall in its path. If you are saying that any thought that is divisive, any thought that divides or takes away from the mythology of the founding of this country, um, under those conditions, it will just be a matter of time before we get rid of Juneteenth. And I see that we have uh, the Dr. Foster by phone, so I will give him a second. And Dr. Foreman, this is your last word. Now, let me give you a hint here. You're supposed to give a word of hope here.
I'll
You guys,
try.
I can be, whatever, but you guys are supposed to. Or is it me? I'm sorry.
We're
We
supposed to
got.
be uplifting.
I forgot I'm relevant. I'm supposed to be the guy who says this out there. Dr. Foreman, not to put words in your mouth.
Yes. So my final thoughts are that, we mustn't forget that this idea of freedom and equality is fleeting, right? It's always changing. Historically, we're seen to be following the same path, and that is a path to resisting social improvements and social movements within our society. And any attempt at trying to change the supremacist, systematic, discrimination and racism in our society, it's going to be met with resistance. So, unfortunately, that has been the pattern. But on an uplifting note, I do believe that if we continue to become more and more educated, as we try to do with ASALH by educating people on the contributions, specifically African American contributions, Black history and culture, in the United States and Africa, the more and more people become educated, possibly we can get to a point where change can happen. Um, I do believe in that. I do believe that that education is the key. Now, we didn't have critical race theory, all of these years. And now there's a resistance to it, but there are a lot of people that are familiar with it. I'm also an anti-racist trainer, anti-bias, unconscious bias trainer, and I train school teachers, on race, on race theory, and this idea of learning how to talk about race. And I believe that long as there are platforms for individuals to be able to talk about these topics and to teach people about the history and also help them understand how best to address the issues of race in America, I do believe that that can make change. And I believe that change starts in schools and in the home. Those are the places I think that are critical to us being able to make this change. But I'm keeping hope alive. I think that we can continue to move forward. I believe that there's a lot of fear. That's why we're getting all of this resistance. There's a lot of fear to that change. However, I believe that we can get there. We can get to a better place.
Can we get there, Dr. Foster? Is there, is there a there? I mean, are we not stuck in the American dilemma that we've been dealing with for a little bit? What is your final word on this in conjunction or in relationship to Juneteenth?
My feeling is that we can get there and then further there because there's no one there that is going to be satisfactory. Now, one thing about Black people in the Americas is that we have always relied on hope,
Yeah.
on redemption, that there's always going to be a moment of redemption. And that is something that we always have to keep before us. And it is a redemption that springs from within us and which we have to be responsible for. So there isn't going to be anyone who is going to deliver it to us as we know it. Lincoln couldn't do it.
That's right.
And indeed, Lincoln had to rely on those Black soldiers, as Dr. Jackson told us, to deliver not only the message, but to deliver the reality of being free. So we will have to continue to do those things. And at the same time, we have to be very careful that we don't let anybody turn us around and that we remain focused on the there that we think is the there for our generation. And then we will hand off the baton to others, and the next generation will take it further. Freedom is not something where we are going to end up in a specific time and place and declare that we are free. Freedom is talking about our humanity, about when do we feel and we know and we are recognized as being fully human, as being fully citizens, so that we can vote the same way like anyone does. So we don't have to stand in line and hope someone bring us water while we wait to vote. That we get to do all of those things that human beings are expected to do. Then and only then are we going to be able to say free at last, free at last. But it is going to be a continuous struggle, but it is one for which we have to be hopeful because life itself is like that. And there's one thing that we can all learn is that the quintessence of being a human being is a Black human being. And that's the way that I see it because we always have to live on a daily basis that story of Sisyphus, of having to roll that rock up the side of the mountain, knowing it's going to be back down, and we roll it up again. And so let's hope that we can enjoy the job of rolling rocks up hills.
Well, Dr. Jackson, a lot of young people, especially, are saying they're tired of rocks. They're tired of rolling them up and rolling them down. They want what everybody else has now. Why do they, generation after generation, have to be dealing with some boulder when everybody else is taking bricks and making houses out of them? We dealing with boulders. Um, what what say you this Juneteenth to that sentiment?
Well, again, in thinking about holidays and what they mean to a nation, I mean, I'm not sure that a holiday like Juneteenth can do that type of work for justice. That's just, I'll be uplifting, but I'm just being honest. I'm not sure that Juneteenth as a holiday can do that type of work for justice, but all holidays are grounded in a mythology and a lore. There's no holiday that I can think of that's just completely historical fact. And in that way, I think that knowing that this is happening right now, this is becoming a nationalized holiday, I think that controlling the narrative is super important. And I really do feel like even if we just get across the message that freedom wasn't some gift that was granted to us, that this was something that Black folks fought really hard for and are still fighting for, right? And so I think that by controlling the narrative and making sure that the holiday is a time to do some of this dismantling of histories that don't talk about self-liberation is a very important way to make sure that this holiday has the right mythology, has the right lore, if you will, if that's even possible. And part of that is this bit about setting up a process, right? One of the beautiful things about thinking about Juneteenth as a concept, even in lore, is that it's sort of rooted to this idea that nobody's free until we're all free.
Yeah.
And even if that's not the hard historical fact, as a holiday mythology, it's kind of lovely. And if we can use that to, create a holiday in which we think about who still needs to be free, what work still needs to be done, then I think that making Juneteenth in a holiday might not have immediate results, but over time it could.
Well put. I agree with all of you that it's unfair to Juneteenth to believe that Juneteenth can solve the nation's problems. That just as it was unfair to believe that a Black president would mean that we are in a post-racial. I love these words. These are great words. Post-racial America. I never bought that then, and it certainly didn't pan out. Post-racial seemed to brought us to an even more racial, but there I go thinking again, and it gets me in trouble. So I agree with everybody that I don't believe that it's unfair to poor Juneteenth to believe that you could solve all of the nation's problems. But when Juneteenth is merely saying, here is a direction that you can go to if you're trying to solve these problems. Here are some examples of what we will have to do, that the Civil War can be defeated, maybe not immediately, but over time, we can do these things. And I am reminded when young people say, especially young and old, who say that they are tired of the boulder, Dr. Foster, they are tired of doing these things, that I would merely say that, what other choice do you have? You can either accept your shackles, or you can accept that we're gonna break these shackles and we'll keep at it till we break it. I am reminded, of course, that as I conclude, watch this one, I'm going to show you something. I'm going to show you why I'm a politician and a historian, as if there's a difference, or as if these things can be united. That's a tough one. I am reminded of the lion of the abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, when he was on his deathbed and some young people came to see him. And they were trying to figure out what to do. And he was really fading, and he was very quiet on his deathbed. And they were speaking to him, and they said, well, sir, the reconstruction has been turned back. And should we just be quiet and accept all of these things? It is said that a light, a fire reanimated his eyes, and he jumped up out of his bed, and he said to them, no, don't be quiet. Agitate, agitate, agitate. And that, I would suggest, is what we need to tell our young people, that in this country, it's unfair that we've got nothing positive without agitation. He also taught us that, in his words, men may not get everything they fight for in life, but they certainly have to fight for everything they get. And this is why Drs. Jackson, Foreman, and Foster, I am so grateful to make your acquaintance by way of this Zoom, this new world that we find ourselves in. This is why it is so important that people understand that they didn't pop into this world by themselves, that it didn't just start overnight, that there's a whole history that got you here. And failure to understand that may mean that you become the victim of the history instead of the victor to it. And this is why we insist on clarity, on all of the issues that we deal with, looking them dead in the eye soberly, that we're not just going to break out some popcorn and say, Juneteenth is here, we have arrived, nor are we going to despair and say that it has no value and no meaning. That we're going to look at this, we're going to be clear, and we're going to use Juneteenth to continue the American experiment, America's contribution to democracy, and we are all but part of it. Thank you all for joining me at this program, and this has been Let's Be Clear. And my friends, if ever you questioned it, you were clear today. Thank you all for being here.